Hail and welcome. Paul here once again. Now, in my last lecture, we talked about the Vikings and the arrival of the great heathen army in England and their defeat into diplomacy by King Alfred of Wessex. I also talked about how Alfred united the remaining Anglo-Saxons in Britain and began to pave the way for the idea that there would be one Kingdom of England, which is how he became known as Alfred the Great. And that is something I forgot to mention in the lecture, probably because that has become such common knowledge to medieval historians, that he was known throughout history as Alfred the Great. However, many will say that his grandson is equally deserving of the title the Great. Now, another thing I forgot to mention, the term Viking is not the name of a culture. It's the name of a job, meaning a raider. It is what they would do. They would go Viking or go raiding. Not every Scandinavian was a Viking, and I guess not every Viking was a Scandinavian for that matter, because it is said that some Frisians and even Anglo-Saxon and Irish outlaws would join Viking warbands sometimes. But you had three main groups who went Viking. The three countries of Scandinavia. You had the Norse, the Norwegians, even though the term Norse has also become a general name for all things Scandinavian. You also had the Danes, the Danish, and the Svir, or the Swedes, the Swedish, who were mostly known for venturing east into Russia and the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Danes and the Norse both would attack and also settle in the British Isles, but the Norse spent more time in northern Scotland and also in Ireland, and the Danes were the ones taking over England for the most part. Alright, so now that I have that out of the way, we left off last time talking about the death of Alfred and the rise of his children, King Edward the Elder and the Lady Ethelfled of Mercia. So Edward rose to the throne at the beginning of the 10th century, though not without a fight, as his cousin Ethelwald would attempt to revolt against Edward, being assisted by the Danes. Edward crushed his cousin and the Danes at the Battle of the Holm in 902, and the threat to his throne was eliminated. Edward's sister, Ethelfled, had ruled alongside her husband Ethelred, the Lord of Mercia, since the reign of her father, King Alfred. After Ethelred's death in the year 911, Ethelfled ruled that kingdom independently as Lady of the Mercians. Now, it isn't written in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or any other English annals that she ever held the title Queen, and this could have been due to sexism in the church. However, the Irish and Welsh annals at the time refer to her as Queen of the Saxons, so she would have held the power of a queen and basically been a queen in all but name, or maybe even referred to by some as queen, for all we know. So, at the beginning of the 10th century, the two remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were ruled by a brother in one and his sister in the other, working together to keep the Vikings at bay, to build fortifications, and to carry out their father's dream of a single Kingdom of England. Now, one of the things I said in my previous lecture was that Alfred built a network of burhs, fortified towns, surrounded by a defensive rampart. The Lady Ethelfled, with the help of her brother Edward, was able to extend those burhs into Mercia, in Tamworth, Bridgenorth, Stafford. One of Ethelfled's greatest accomplishments was fortifying the Midlands. In the year 907, while her husband was still alive, but sick, she defeated a large fleet of Norwegian Vikings who had sailed to Britain from their settlement in Ireland. This was the Battle of Chester, one of the lady's greatest achievements. 10 years later, in 917, she captured Derby, which was one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, the regions in Mercia ruled by Viking earls. A year later, the Danes of Leicester surrendered without a fight. Shortly after, the Danes of York, in Northumbria, offered their loyalty, but she died soon after. As for her brother, Edward, King of Wessex, at the beginning of his reign, after crushing the rebellion of his cousin, he made peace with the Danes of East Anglia and Northumbria, though it seemed to be a peace made from buying them off. 3 years later, he sent West Saxon and Mercian armies into Northumbria to retrieve the bones of St. Oswald. The holy relics were transferred to a church in Mercia, and the Danes were forced to accept peace on Edward's terms. In the following year, the Northumbrian Danes revolted against Edward, but would then be crushed at the Battle of Tetton Hall. After that, the Vikings of Northumbria never ventured south of the Humber, and Edward and his sister were able to conquer land from the Vikings in East Anglia and Mercia, which they did diligently from 911 to 918, building defensive fortifications and working together as siblings. Edward died in 924, a few years after putting down a Welsh revolt in Chester, and was buried in Newminster Church, in the capital of Wessex, Winchester, where his father was buried. And so begins the rise of Athelstan. After Edward's death, his son Athelstan would have been recognized as King of Mercia, but his other son, Elfweird, would have been considered King of Wessex. However, Alfweird died within 3 weeks of his father's death, giving Athelstan the go-ahead to inherit both kingdoms. At first, the West Saxons resisted him, and therefore he was not officially crowned until 925. Athelstan's first mission as king was to finish what his father and aunt started with the Vikings. In 926, he had arranged for his sister to be married to the Danish king of York, Sigtryg. The two kings made peace. However, after Sigtryg died, Athelstan invaded York and defeated the armies of Sigtryg's cousin, Guthfrith, who sailed to Northumbria with a large fleet from Dublin. Athelstan then captured York and forced the Danes into submission. Further north, in Brunnenburg, the Anglo-Saxons still ruled as independent lords. However, the Lord of Brunnenburg, Ealdred I, had accepted Athelstan's overlordship, as he did with his father, Edward. Athelstan then began his subjugation of the Celtic peoples. First, at Eamont Bridge, he received an oath of loyalty from the two kings in Scotland, Constantine II of Alba, the main kingdom that took up the majority of Scotland, and Owain of Strathclyde, the Brythonic kingdom in the southwest. Both kings promised to keep the peace with the Anglo-Saxons and to keep the Danes under control. After that, the Welsh kings agreed to pay him a large yearly tribute, which was 2,500 cows, 20 pounds of gold, 300 pounds of silver, and a supply of hawks and hounds. He also successfully crushed a Cornish resistance, turning Cornwall into a vassal state of Wessex. Athelstan achieved everything that his grandfather dreamed of, and then some. He became king of all Anglo-Saxons, as well as overlord of the Danes, Scots, and Britons. He was the first king of the English, and the overlord of the First British Empire, Athelstan, King of England. But Athelstan was far more than just a formidable warrior king. He was also well educated and cultured. He followed in his grandfather's footsteps in spreading ecclesiastical studies, and was known as a collector of books and relics. He was also closely connected to the Carolingian monarchs on the continent, much like his great-grandfather Ecbert, who was exiled in the court of Charlemagne. Athelstan learned much about being a powerful monarch through Charlemagne's descendants. So at his peak, Athelstan had much of Britain in his grip, and also spread education, as his grandfather before him did. But Athelstan wanted more. In 934, he invaded Scotland. The reasons for this invasion are unclear, but the 12th century chronicler John of Worcester suggests that it could have been due to King Constantine violating the peace treaty that they agreed to. Apparently, the Saxons made it as far as Caithness, up near the Orkney Islands. At this point, the people of Scotland were done with their English overlord, and with the help of some trusty Vikings, they began to revolt. These Vikings were led by Olaf Guthfrithson. Olaf was the king of Viking Dublin, and the son of the last Viking king of Northumbria, Guthfrith, who Athelstan forced into submission. With the help of the Scottish kings, Olaf felt he could avenge his father and bring back Viking Northumbria. Olaf sailed from Dublin in 937 to meet with Constantine of Alba and Owain of Strathclyde to ravage their way down through Northumbria and Mercia. Athelstan then rode north with his brother, the Ethel and Edward, and their Saxon army to meet with this deadly alliance of Vikings and Celts at a place called Brunnenburg. The exact location of Brunnenburg is unknown, and what we do know about the battle, we know from the Old English poem that is written in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, I will be sharing this poem for you at the end of this lecture. The battle lasted all day. Both sides met shield wall to shield wall. The poem describes the dead kings and earls on the battlefield and the surviving Vikings frantically sailing back to Dublin in their ships while their dead sons are devoured by ravens and wolves. The poem also claims that it was the greatest battle ever fought in England, and that never had such a victory been seen since the Anglo-Saxons first crossed the North Sea and settled in Britain in the 5th century. Now, Athelstan failed in uniting the entire island. Alba and Strathclyde remained largely independent from the English, and no English king would attempt to conquer Scotland until Edward Longshanks in the 14th century, and even he couldn't succeed. Athelstan would also begin to lose his grip on Northumbria, and after he died, Olaf would regain control of Northumbria, and that part of England would continue to be ruled by Scandinavians for the next 20 years, ending with Eric Bloodaxe in 954, who we will speak about next time. Athelstan died in Gloucester on October 27th, 939. Now, rather than being buried in Winchester, where his half-brother and father and grandfather were buried, he chose to be buried in Malmesbury Abbey, beside the cousins that he fought beside at Brunnenburg, both as a tribute to them and to his devotion to that abbey. Now, if there is one thing that Athelstan did succeed in, it was being the first monarch to truly earn the title King of the English, an idea that was put into theory by his great-grandfather, attempted by his grandfather, but which only Athelstan could truly put into practice. And now, I promised you some poetry, and I will give you some poetry. I will read for you the Battle of Brunnenburg. In the year of our Lord, 937. In this year, King Athelstan, Lord of Earls and Ring-giver of men, and his brother also, Prince Edmund, lifelong glory, won in strife, with swords' edges near Brunnenburg. They split the shield wall, hewed the battle-wood with hammer-beaten blades. Edward's sons, as it was their birthright, that they often in battle against every enemy defended the land, treasures, and homes. Their enemies perished, the men of the Scots and the men of the sea. Fated they fell, the field darkened with the blood of men. From the rising of the sun in morning time, when that glorious light glided over the ground, bright candle of God, of the eternal Lord, until that noble creation sank to rest. There lay many warriors, destroyed by spears. Men of the north shot over shield, and so too the Scots, weary, sated with war. The West Saxons, thence the length of the day in troops, pursued the hated peoples, hewed the fugitive harshly from behind with mill-sharpened swords. The Mercians did not deny hard handplay to any heroes, who with Olaf over the sea surge in the belly of a ship had sought land, fated to fight. 5 lay still on that battlefield, young kings by swords put to sleep, and 7 also of Olaf's earls, countless of the army, of sailors and Scotsmen. There was put to flight the Northmen's chief, driven by need to the ship's prow with a little band. He shoved the ship to sea. The king disappeared on the dark flood. His own life he saved. So there also the old one came in flight to his home in the north. Constantine, that hoary-haired warrior, had no cause to exult at the meeting of swords. He was shorn of his kin, deprived of his friends on the field, bereft in the fray, and his son behind on the place of slaughter, with wounds ground to pieces, too young in battle. He could make no boast, that gray-haired warrior of the sword slaughter, the old deceitful one, no more than could Olaf. With the remnant of their army, they had no reason to laugh, that they were better in the work of war. On the battlefield, of the clashing of banners, of the meeting of spears, of the meeting of men, of the exchange of weapons, when they on the field of death played with the sons of Edward. Departed then the Northmen in their nailed ships, dreary survivors of the spears, on Dingismere, over deep water, to seek Dublin, back to Ireland, ashamed in spirit. Thus the brothers both together, king and prince, sought their home. The West Saxons land exultant from war. They left behind to divide the corpses, the dark-coated one, the black raven, the horn-beaked one, and the dust-coated one, the white-tailed eagle to enjoy the carrion, that greedy warhawk, and that gray beast, the wolf of the wood. Never was there more slaughter on this island. Never as many folk felled before this by the sword's edges, as those books tell us, old authorities, since here from the east the Angles and Saxons came ashore. Over the broad salt sea they sought Britain. Those proud warsmiths, they overcame the Welsh, glory-eager earls, and took hold of this land. West Hall.